Hello. To Clean Energy Connections. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Gianthi. I work at Solar One. Rockstar, thank you. And this is the start of our 4th year, and this is our 17th event. I would just like to, yeah, that's pretty awesome. That's pretty great. Thanks, guys. So right now we're in pre-show. We haven't started taping yet, so I'm going to just run through some etiquette. And first and foremost, I would like you to put your cell phones on silent, but do not turn them off because we want you to tweet. Yay! There's information about tweeting on this black background slide and also on each and every one of your programs. Yay! The second thing, if you have questions, this is a conversation, you know, it's not just like a panel discussion. We want questions from the audience. There are 2 ways that you can ask those questions. Number 1, with note cards, right? You just write it on a note card and a golf pencil. How many people got note cards and golf pencils? Okay, if you didn't, now is your time to go and grab them. Note cards and golf pencils, and then we have 2 card runners. Rebecca over there. And then where's our other card runner? Hi, William, right? Yay! And so Rebecca and William, they're going to be walking around and basically just, they're not going to be able to read your minds. So if you do have a question that you want to go to the speaker, just raise your hand up, and then they'll grab it and they'll bring it to Alex over there. And Alex is going to, we actually now have a title for you. It's Moderator Card Liaison. Yeah, I know. I'm glad everybody thought that was funny. And that's it. So I think, welcome to the show, and we're just going to kick things off. So let's wait for Micah to get on stage, and then we'll start. Micah? Micah? There we go. Yay. And thumbs up when we start? Great.
How you guys doing? Right. Some energy.
Packed house tonight.
Yeah.
It's great.
Excellent.
Okay, we're good.
Cool. Okay. Welcome to our first Clean Energy Connections event of 2014. This is year 4, as Sarah mentioned, and I think this has really become an institution, and I'm so happy that this year we're kicking things off with this event. So we wanted to start this year with an exploration of distributed PV, which is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I was involved with a neighborhood group in Brooklyn called Solarize Brooklyn, where there were like 3 or 4 of us who were interested in exploring the opportunity to put solar on our roofs. So we thought that we might get 10 of our neighbors in Windsor Terrace in Brooklyn to be interested in joining us and put out an RFP and see if we could find a vendor who would come in and give us a good price for solar. And what we found was there was something like 450 of our neighbors across Windsor Terrace and Kensington and Flatbush and Park Slope who were interested in this thing. And we actually got 8 responses to an RFP that we put out with prices that we thought were a little bit high to start with.
Yeah.
But it really kind of gave us a sense of where the industry was, and I think that it's real validation that, particularly in New York City, there is a movement and people who are really interested in distributed systems. And there's a growing industry here of distributors and people in project finance who are interested in building these things at scale. So for us, it was a great kind of test case, and I think that the panel tonight will kind of help us to understand where we're at from a technology perspective, from a policy perspective, and from a market perspective of how solar is integrating with this concept of the grid edge, which Rick is going to tell you guys about later. But tonight is also very bittersweet for us in the Clean Energy Connections family because it's Sarah's last event. Yeah, I know. So I just want to say a couple of words from the heart about working with Sarah over the last several years. So Sarah had, before we did this, believe it or not, zero experience in video production. Like no relevant experience in anything related to media or holding an event like in a flagship broadcast facility like this. And it was really kind of me and her and Max and a couple of other people who were like, there are all these great events happening in New York. There are all these fantastic opportunities for thought leadership, for a real platform for thought leadership, to hear from really brilliant people who are, working at startups, working at the utilities, making policy. And yet, if you're not in the room, it's almost impossible to kind of track the dialogue and to interact with other people who care about this issue. So we're like, where can we do an event where we can archive it, where we can live stream it, where we can allow people really from across the city, but all around the world to kind of tune in? And can we bring together smart people who don't always speak the same language, right? People from Wall Street and people from academia and people from the startup community and the media industry and the other industries across real estate and power and energy who don't always kind of share the same room or speak the same language. Can we give those people a place to interact and drink great beer? And so doing this and kind of going on into year 4 and working with Sarah has really been a joy, and she's been a consummate professional and brought a work ethic that we all admire. And I think there's a real joy and passion that she's brought to this, which has made this series what it is today. And so please join me in thanking her for all her hard work, which has really gone above and beyond what she's supposed to do. All right, so thank you. So I'm going to let her tell you what she's doing next, but before I do, I want to plug 2 things that are also happening before we do our next event. So one Sarah will tell you about is the kickoff of the Greentech Open, and that's on March 19th at our new home. The next is on the 20th. We have a really interesting energy historian of New York City, a guy named Joseph Cunningham, who's going to talk about the war of the currents, AC versus DC. And that's on March 20th, also in Brooklyn at this new Urban Future Lab. And then on April 10th, we're hosting a fundraiser with YPE and I think the BDR Foundation. It's a benefit for solar schools, and that's on April 10th. So all this info and how to sign up, everything like that, you can find on the NYC Acre website, and hopefully we'll see you guys there. If not, then at the next event here on May 14th. But Sarah?
Thank you, Micah. Micah, you're the best. Yeah, it's really bittersweet to be leaving Clean Energy Connections. Yeah, when I started, it was just like an idea that Micah and I had, and I was like, let's just do one event. And Micah was like, let's do 6, and let's do it in a television studio space. And I was like, okay. The great thing about Micah, he just thinks so big. And 4 years later, here we are, and you're all here, and I just think it's been such a great thing for the clean tech community, and I'm so glad to have been a part of it. But where am I going next? There is a new program that's being launched from NECC, which is an organization in Boston. They actually our combination of like the New England Clean Energy Council and the NECEC Institute. And they are launching a brand new program called Greentech Navigate. It is a regional support network for the clean tech community in the Northeast. So we're going to have, a lot of times you're thinking, okay, if you're a New York company, there are New York resources, and that's all you really think of. And a Massachusetts company, you think about the Massachusetts resource. The vision of the Greentech Navigate is that we are all a community. We are a regional support network, and a New York company should take advantage of stuff in Boston and in Maine, and a New York City company should take advantage of stuff in upstate New York. Boston companies should take advantage of stuff in New York City. So I'm going to be running the New York State chapter. So it's really exciting, and I hope to be working with all of you on growing and connecting this community so that we're all working together and we're all growing and we're all kind of making this the best tech community in the world. So that's my big plug. Yeah. Clean tech. Plugs. Okay. So the thing that Micah was mentioning is that NECC also runs the Clean Tech Open Northeast, which is the startup accelerator program that's been around for quite a few years. And so, did I just hear a woo? Okay, that's cool. They are doing their kickoff event in New York City on March 19th. So if you are a startup and you want to be a part of an accelerator program, if you're interested in meeting awesome startups, if you just want to be part of this community and hang out with other people in this community, come on March 19th. It's in their new home in the Urban Future Lab. Yeah, actually, if you are part of the Clean Energy Connections mailing list, we are mailing out information about it on March 6th, so stay tuned. And I think that is it. So, last thing. So if you have questions, this is for the online audience because the in-person audience already got it. Tweet your questions to @CleanEC NYC #CleanNRGX. In-person audience, you can also do that, and you can also do it on your super fun note cards and golf pencils. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, or our opening speaker for tonight, Rick Thompson. He is one of the co-founders of Greentech Media, and he is going to be talking about our special series for this year for the Grid Edge. So welcome, Rick.
I'm going to lose this thing here. Thanks. Yeah, there we go. All I heard was AC/DC's playing at the Urban Future Lab. That sounds cool. So, yeah, I did one of these before these events, and like right about now, since we're live streaming it, I got a text, and it was my mother like saying I wasn't on the live stream yet or whatever. So if my mom's out there, hi. But Grid Edge is actually a term that we had coined last year at Greentech Media and GTM Research. So before we get into the panel, which we'll get into a lot of the details around the growth of PV and what has to happen in terms of the grid, I think it needs a little bit of explaining about what the Grid Edge is. So that's essentially what I'm going to spend a few minutes trying to do. But before I do, I just want to again thank SolarOne and thank NYC ACA for having us. And just remind everyone in the room that we are actually live streaming this over greentechmedia.com, so we have a bit of a broader audience out there. So next slide, please. So just really quickly to talk about this series, we've been working with these two organizations for a number of years and doing these events. And when Micah and I met late last year, I suggested that we try to come up with a theme for all of the events throughout the year, which we hadn't really done before in the past. And that theme turned out to be Grid Edge, and I'll explain what that is as I go through the introduction. But just quickly to mention what events will be happening later in the year. Tonight, I think will be very interesting because when I get into what Grid Edge is, I think what you'll see is that there are different stakeholders from all different parts of the industry. So you're going to have power utilities, you're going to have startup vendors, you're going to have financiers and kind of new third-party types of service providers. And I think we have a good mix of all those on the panel tonight with Con Ed, Gridco System, a startup from Boston, SolarCity, and Sunlight General Capital. So it's a nice cross-section of panelists to cover this in great detail. And GTM Research will be moderating it, and I'll introduce Ben in just a minute to kick that off. But in May, you can kind of see the exact titles in your program, but we're going to be talking about intelligent storage. So one of the things that is paramount to grow PV is to have a proliferation of energy storage out there. And that has traditionally been a very big challenge for the industry because of cost and technology availability and a number of things. So we're starting to see that rapidly advance, and we're starting to see policy, especially in places like California, enable the deployment of those technologies. But beyond kind of the material science and the chemistry of storage and battery technology, which has predominantly been what's been driving up the cost and complexity of these products, we're starting to see a whole other host of interesting companies that are working out kind of coordination software for distributed storage systems. So that'll largely be what the second event's about. The third one looks at intelligent buildings and building management systems that are connected to a smart grid. And the final one looks at really kind of the software layer of the grid edge. And I'll go through the different layers. And talks about how important the data is that's being collected from whether it's a PV system, whether it's a home energy management system, et cetera, and how software and analytics are going to be applied into the energy world, much like they're being applied into the internet world. The Facebooks, the Amazon.coms of the world use analytics to sell you products. All these types of analytic technologies are now being applied to energy. So we're going to try to cover a nice cross-section of those things. So the grid edge, just at a very high level, and I'll kind of explain it in more detail, is if you were to say tomorrow, everyone in the United States is going to have solar on their rooftops. Everyone will be like, all right, that sounds great, yeah, awesome. But the reality is, if that actually happened, it would be fundamentally problematic for the electric grid and the generation of that power. There would be a lot of issues, and that's technically what, at its core, the grid edge is looking at. It's marrying the grid infrastructure technology and the evolution that's happening there with what's happening kind of at the home or the business in terms of distributed generation, energy management, and even new load types like electric vehicles. So the load profiles are very different, and you're starting to move generation out to the edge. So when you start to marry these two things together, that's kind of the whole thesis of grid edge, and I'll explain a little more technically what it is. But there are really 5 main drivers for what's I guess causing this. You could call it a pain point for utilities. You could call it an opportunity for them. You can call it an opportunity for the market and for vendors. But the first is distributed generation and decentralization. So as you know, when you put PV on a rooftop, you're moving the generation from a central generator, which is likely a coal-fired power plant, to solar on someone's roof. If you do that on millions of homes across the country, you're starting to literally distribute the generation that was previously very centralized, and this is not all that different from other types of decentralization and distribution technologies and shifts that have occurred in computing when you went from mainframe computing to desktop computing to laptops and now mobile computing. It's a very similar type of thing. When you change that fundamental point of where something, whether it's computing, whether it's energy generation, occurs, everything in the middle, you have to relook at how it's architected, how it's built, and how it's connected. And that's essentially a core to most of how this grid edge will evolve. Intermittency and unpredictability, I think, is a big issue. So clearly today, with traditional energy generation, it's very predictable. It's not intermittent at all. So you can rest assured that when you go home and you turn the lights on, it's going to work, and et cetera, et cetera. In most cases, when you start to put a high penetration of renewables out there, you start to run into intermittency issues and unpredictability issues. And so controlling that and communicating those issues via software and hardware technologies, either back to the utility or back to some third-party energy provider, is going to be key in enabling and solving that problem so that you can essentially deploy these technologies at scale. So we'll talk a lot about PV tonight in the panel, and solar PV is really one of the main drivers of grid edge, but it also kind of depends on what state you're in. If you're in California and you have a lot of PV being deployed, it's the #1 solar deployment in the United States, that's maybe a main driver for you. If you're in the Northeast, for example, last year's Superstorm Sandy, resiliency and reliability is a major factor. And I think that when you start to create a distributed system, some of the utilities are a little bit concerned because they're like, oh, well, what happens to our reliability that we're so used to? But inherently, a distributed system is much more reliable. Just take another example is take a look at the internet. It's highly distributed. You don't have widespread internet outages where like entire cities are out for an entire days or weeks or et cetera, like we had in New York City last year. And so once you start to distribute these assets and control them between one another, you create a much more resilient infrastructure in the event of major catastrophic storms that are essentially predicted to increase based on climate change. The fourth one being the availability of energy-centric IT, and I think this is fundamentally another thing that's not necessarily new, it's just new to this market. So if you look at all the technologies that went into building the internet, all the technologies that went into building telecom networks, many of those things, whether it be networking protocols, whether it be data analytics software, they're now being adapted to energy-specific applications, and there are a ton of companies out there that are developing these and will have opportunity in this world going forward. And then finally is the transformation of the traditional utility business model, and this is probably one of the biggest challenges because it's not something that technology is there largely today and will continue to be there over the course of the next few years, but to change the way an entire industry has done business for 100 years and then enable policy to let them make these changes, that's much more of a essentially a political issue or a business issue in terms of how do they recover costs, how do they reward their investors, those kinds of things. So that transformation is happening whether utilities like it or not, based on the sheer fact that solar is growing and it's going to continue to grow. So with that said, a couple intro slides about solar. It's really not a question of if, but when. And if any of you kind of tuned into Barack Obama's State of the Union address in January, one of the things that he mentioned was every 4 minutes another American home or business goes solar. That data point actually came from GTM Research, and we're forecasting in 2016 that it's going to be about roughly a new solar deployment every 80 seconds or so. So it's definitely not a question of if, it's just a question of when and how much. And these are some numbers. I had to actually earlier in the day, you'll see on the little black boxes on the left there are blacked out. We are actually announcing these numbers later tonight, so we're under embargo with various press outlets. But I can share a little bit of that with you, and then tomorrow on our website, some of the details will be available. But in 2013, the solar market in the United States grew over 35% with over 4.5 gigawatts deployed. And if you take a look at that number, that amount of deployment just in 2013 alone is greater than all solar deployments in the 30 years prior to that. So we're clearly at the beginning of what I would call a hockey stick curve, and we're forecasting, next year, cumulative 18 gigawatts, and that'll put the United States, I believe, in third place essentially with total gigawatts deployed in the year 2014. China being number one, Japan being number two. So now just a couple quick slides on the grid edge itself to explain it a little bit more, and then I'll introduce the panel. There's really I'm going to present this simple version of the slide first, and then the next slide kind of blows this out in more detail. So you can see there's kind of a cube there that has three sides showing. One side is essentially the utility electric grid. So there's a lot of things. You may have heard the word smart grid or other types of terminology. That whole face of the cube is really about grid modernization and all the technologies that go into enabling that. And then on the other side of the cube, I would call customer evolution. So this is everything happening behind the customer's meter, whether it's a residential consumer or a commercial industrial consumer. You might have PV being deployed. You might have EVs being purchased in pockets of various demographics. You have energy management systems being put into place. You saw Nest recently was acquired by Google for $3 billion. They're doing home energy management systems and smart home technologies. So you've got a lot of things happening both on the utility side of the meter and the customer side of the meter. that are now finally starting to come together and form this grid edge stack, as we like to call it. And then on the top, you can go to the next slide. Yeah, that one's good. On the top layer is really about business model transformation. So it's basically looking at the different layers, what's happening with the technology, and stating that there are going to be new types of opportunities for utilities to evolve. New players are going to enter the market. SolarCity's here tonight. They're obviously, viewed in some ways maybe a threat to utilities. Utilities are, potentially looking at, working with them and embracing, folks like that. So how all these entities will end up working together, down the road is a little bit unclear. And that market confusion is really, embodied in this diagram here, which is very detailed, and I don't expect you to be able to read it all. But essentially, we made this last year when we came up with the concept of grid edge. And we have a whole market research practice where we do in-depth research on each of these, little boxes, et cetera. But this is essentially modeled after the 7-layer OSI stack that the internet is fundamentally built on. So you have a physical layer, and you go all the way up to the top, and you have an application layer. It's not all that dissimilar here. You have a physical layer of the grid. On the grid side, you have, look out the window, you've got power transformers, you've got electric poles and lines, and those go back to substations, and in between you've got reclosers, all this crazy hardware, right? And on the customer side, you're starting to see the physical layer there being distributed PV, more advanced customers with maybe distributed storage. There are other types of generation, could be fuel cells, could be CHP. We tend to focus a little bit more on PV just because that's the main driver for distributed generation. And then if you go up, you have kind of a network and control layer. So you have these physical assets at the bottom, and then above that, you have a networking layer that's not dissimilar at all from telecom networks. They're using IP protocols just adapted for specific types of assets they need to connect and talk to. You may have heard the term Internet of Things. This is squarely in the space of Internet of Things. And this is really the control protocols and the languages that enable these devices to talk to one another. And then above that, you have the application layer. So now that you have all this technology in place, okay, well, what can you do with it? If you're a utility, you can have some interesting load forecasting technologies and systems. You can do advanced metering. The list goes on. And if you're a consumer, you might have a more tightly controlled home energy management system that you can set to either price signals or other types of things that are driving you as a consumer. And then above all of that, you have this analytics layer. So I don't know if any of you, probably many of you in the room are familiar with O-Power. They just announced this week that they filed their S1 for an IPO. We covered it, I think, yesterday. O-Power has done a great job of consumer analytics and letting the utilities understand exactly how different demographics of utilities are consuming power, and that's only going to get more and more complex. So today it's pretty basic. It's a smart meter and it's kind of aggregate consumption, but when you start to put batteries, electric vehicles, solar panels, inverters that are connected to those solar panels, all these things are going to have communications interfaces, smart appliances, so that you can not just have an aggregate load, but a very detailed load per device to understand where you can do some energy savings. The amount of analytics on the consumer side is just going to continue to grow, and people are going to benefit from the services that are enabled by the availability of that data. And similarly, on the utility side, they've got a ton of connected assets. They might have a transformer in Berkeley that has an electric vehicle attached to it today, and in 6 months, it might have 4 electric vehicles attached to it. And they can predict failures of those types of devices much more quickly if they can see load types like that coming onto the system versus just waiting for it to fail, having an outage, and having customers call in and be pissed off because they don't have power. So there's a ton of benefits, and the bottom line is it's very, very similar to how the internet architecture has evolved, and quite frankly, using technologies from that world. So with that, hopefully that kind of explains what the grid edge is in some sense. And I'm going to introduce Ben Kellison. He's a senior analyst with GTM Research to kick off the panel. We've got some great speakers, so thanks very much.
Just want to say, start up by saying thank you, Rick, and thank you to NYC Acre and Solar One for having me today and having our panelists here as well. Just as a heads up just as a reminder, I should say, to all those in the audience, as well as all those on Twitter, for the audience, please ask questions. There'll be people walking around gathering those throughout the next hour or so. For those on Twitter, please feel free to ask questions as well. We'll have some time at the end to address those. With that being said, Rick went into this a little bit, but just give a little bit of an idea on how we've started to be, how the movement towards distributed solar has really come about in the last few years. From our solar wing of GTM Research, what we've calculated is the price of installing solar in the United States has decreased around 50% in the last 3 years. It's led to a very fast acceleration in deployment of solar, and it's brought to the forefront of many utilities' minds, as well as many in the industry's minds, like the knock-on effects of this addition, as well as the effects related to economics, the actual technical effects, which Rick got into a little bit, as well as the effects on stakeholders involved. So looking at that, I just want to say we have some great panelists today with me to dive into some of those issues, as well as understand the type and magnitude of some of the questions that pop up and some of the business problems that pop up. So with that, I want to let our panelists introduce themselves, say a little bit about their role, as well as what company they're with, and what are you most excited about with distributed solar, as well as what concerns you the most moving forward. So Margaret.
Hi, everyone. So you can read my bio in here. I'm Margaret Jolly. I'm the Director of Research and Development at Edison. And my career started out working in traditional power plants. And so this is coming sort of full circle. Went through a wonky phase in the policy group, and now this is sort of combining a lot of that together. I would say what I'm most excited about is being an engineer. Just the thought of two-way flows on the grid, I think, is really an interesting concept to think about how to manage that. We love our customers and we love our grid, and we want our customers to love our grid. So we want to be able to figure out how we can all play in this together. What I'm most concerned about is that the technology might not be able to keep up with the two-way flows. And I think just one way to think about that is, generally one thinks that the highest load happens in the afternoon in the summer, and it does on the transmission side. But for residential customers, the peak is at night, around 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, and that's not when the sun is shining. So being able to manage some of those loads, I think, is going to be a concern.
Great. I'm Shaun Chapman. I'm a director for policy and electricity markets for SolarCity. We're the largest solar energy services company in the nation. We now employ over 5,000 people. I also serve as the president of NYSEA, the New York State Solar Energies Industries Association as well. My background is I was an actor and also an economist, so I can speak to economic policy quite well. And what I don't know, I just can pretend that I know. So we have that. And with that, I have a tendency to say strident things. So anything you don't like, just remember my Twitter handle is @SUNRUN. So if you don't like what I have to say, that's our Twitter handle. What I'm most concerned about is climate change. And what I'm most excited about is human beings' capacity to innovate and reinvent ways to address the problems that have faced us over millennia. And I believe that we're at that critical stage with climate change right now, and I believe that humans will be able to overcome it.
I'm Stacey Hughes, and I'm one of the founding partners at Sunlight General Capital, which is a New York City-based business. We're bringing a finance expertise to the space. I worked in finance and banking for many years, and what we do primarily is try to take the number of great, exciting solar projects that are out there, distributed generation, and marry those with the really large pools of capital that are interested in getting behind and facilitating such solar projects. And it's not easy. It's a new industry. It's kind of a nascent industry. And we're using kind of old world finance tools to try to come to this new space. Again, you can read my bio as well in the list. In terms of what I'm really excited about, I think the two things are, first of all, just realizing, which I think I have a chance to see in the job I'm doing now, how much capital there really is, how many investors that for both altruistic but also return reasons are excited in this space and what that can mean in terms of how it can take off. And I'm also tremendously excited at the idea of decentralization of energy to some degree. I mean, it's a real mix of policy, but I love that as well, power really being generated where it's being consumed. The biggest concern that I probably run into is, again, coming back to that finance side, it's investors are very boring and conservative, and they like to know what they're going to get. And it's not that any one thing can't work, or it has to be this tariff, or it has to be this incentive, or it has to be that. It doesn't, but it has to be something that people can trust and count on, whatever it may be. And so I think it's trying to bring some degree of security to the investment space so that every 6 months, everything isn't changing.
I'm Naimish Patel. I'm the CEO of Gridco Systems. What we do is we build utility-scale power regulation infrastructure, in particular, that enables utilities to reliably integrate renewable sources of power, distributed sources of power, enables utilities to also extract deeper levels of both demand and energy curtailment when they'd like to, and also bring resiliency and reliability enhancements to the grid as a whole. We build hardware and software to do these functions. What I'd say I'm most excited about is really two things. One is the continually improving economics of PV in conjunction with, and importantly in conjunction with, the innovation and financing mechanisms for the deployment of PV. Creates now a very clear path to effectively grid parity distributed generation. The second piece is really for a first time in 100 years since the introduction of the grid here in New York by Edison, we're now seeing a fundamentally different use case for the grid. In particular, not just few central generation sources and unidirectional power flow to relatively homogeneous loads, but rather that the customers of the grid are indeed becoming also suppliers on the grid. And that creates the opportunity to apply technologies from a wide variety of fields. Rick mentioned the applications of some internet and telecom-based technologies, but those in conjunction with innovations that have resulted from hybrid electric vehicles in power electronics and reliable power electronics that can now be applied at utility scale to address some of these challenges. So those are two things I would say I'm most excited about. The concerns I have, one I would reiterate one mentioned before, which is around how do we maintain the reliability of the grid in the face of increasingly distributed generation sources and two-way power flow. But I'm also concerned about the underlying economic implications of customers increasingly going off-grid by adoption of local generation sources, and what that means to rates for those that actually don't adopt local generation sources. There's some significant implications into the economics of all of the customers of the grid, and that's one of the other areas of concern I have.
So just to start us off, for those of you who may not be familiar or extremely familiar with kind of how the grid architecture, what actually it consists of, kind of how power is actually distributed, generated, et cetera. Margaret, can you give a little bit of a 101 on that, as well as a little bit of 101 on some of the differences within Con Ed as well?
So there's two fundamentally different types of grid architectures. And you'll know which one you're in because one is either underground or overhead. And the underground systems are networked together. They're highly reliable. They have a lot of redundancies, and they're very expensive, in part because of the redundancies and in part because they're underground. And to get at them, you have to dig up the street, which is a great inconvenience and takes a long time and can be more expensive. But again, it is a sort of a stronger backbone. And then on the overhead system, those are the ones that you see where there's poles and wires and transformers. And again, that's generally the flow is not networked. It's generally going one way, and so the challenge with PV is if you're installing generation at the end that can either really support that last mile of the grid, or it can, if there's a lot of it, you can have some funky voltages, and because of the intermittency, you're managing the flows can be difficult. On the networked grid, the protection systems have been designed historically for one-way flow, and so some of the protection systems would have to be changed. Some communications you might need back to the control rooms, and there are technology solutions. Some of them have been deployed. So again, it's fundamentally very different engineering, but and different challenges and different opportunities.
Okay. And so just looking at some of the differences that need to occur in a more distributed, for more distributed generation to actually be out there. Shaun, do you have some commentary on that?
Clarify. What do you mean?
So when we're looking at technical changes, at least for initial steps, when it comes down to the architectural components, moving to two-way power flows, moving to a more decentralized grid.
Yeah.
What kind of technical changes need to occur, at least first steps, or what kind of technical changes are you guys running into and looking at?
So, I mean, the biggest hurdle for us as a development in the development stage is economics, strictly. I mean, I take my parents, for example. They sometimes still, when we pass their house on their dirt road in Richmond, Massachusetts, they refer to some of the power lines as their telephone poles. Like they go, those are ours, because they paid for them, literally out of pocket, because they didn't have service. And one of the biggest challenges for a development company is if you're the first on, or even the last on of what the local utility company has said is allowed to be on that service, you're stuck with the whole bill. So that's just a huge roadblock for upgrading the system. If the last person in or the first person in, depending on how the economics are being set up, if it's all being put on the plate of that developer for that one project, instead of spreading it out amongst projects, thinking about it in a bigger, more holistic, fashion, spreading it around all ratepayers, et cetera, that kind of thing. But if it's because if it's going to be on the last person in, that project's not going to be developed, and that last project is never going to be developed by anyone if the economics are too high. So I didn't really answer your technical question, but we're seeing it more on an economic level of the fact that the technical solutions aren't being addressed because the economics get in the way before the technical solution.
So that brings up a actually important question on the technical side. If you're looking at upgrades, how scalable are what are upgrades that we're actually looking at? If it's a binary, I put in a new transformer, or I put in this new piece of equipment, there are lines at which that next upgrade may be tremendously expensive. What kind of scalability do we actually have with maybe radial versus networked? Maybe Naimish, you want to take a first stab at this?
Sure. So, fundamentally, that the PV introduces two basic challenges in the integration on an electric grid. The first is that its output is time varying, and the second is that because during certain times of day, the direction of power flow changes, naturally the voltages on the feeder change. Now, distribution engineers have built and have come up with design rules, literally over the last 100 years, to manage voltage. After all, utilities are required to deliver voltage within a specific range. It's called the ANSI range in the United States. And these design rules made the fundamental assumption that power flowed only downstream from the substation. And so now that there's two-way power flow, those design rules need to change. And one way to address it, and the typical way to address it in the absence of new tools, has actually been to do one of three things. The voltage deviations, in particular the voltage rises that occur, can be mitigated by literally changing the wires. So increasing the gauge of the wires, making them thicker, in effect reducing their impedance or resistance. Another thing that can be done is to increase the size of the transformers that are subtending the locations where there's PV in a same vein to try to reduce the impedance. And the third is to try to use active elements, things like capacitor banks and voltage regulators and others, to try to manage the voltage in a dynamic fashion. The challenge with these is if you have got underground distribution, then the costs of reconductoring, that is changing the wires, is very high. And the the solutions that rely on the traditional technologies like capacitor banks and voltage regulators are slow in response. So if you're getting, cloud cover that's moving over your photovoltaic panels, its output is varying on the order of sometimes seconds, and mechanical devices are just simply not able to keep up. So what's fundamentally needed is a set of infrastructure that's able to manage the voltage within the ANSI range, the standard range, without using moving parts. And this is where some of the innovations I mentioned before that have come from other industries, including solar inverter industry, including hybrid electric vehicle drives, now provide us, the industry, a set of components that can indeed be used to build such devices to dynamically and in a distributed way regulate voltage. Now, I would say that's phase one of the problem. Phase two of the problem at even higher penetrations is one fundamentally of supply-demand balance. If you have, and by the way, Germany, we're seeing this right now. Germany, of all countries in the world, has the highest capacity of deployed PV. And so there, I would say, on the front edge of seeing this class of problems that I'm just describing. And they do things like reconductoring, but now they're actually starting to see the need to manage those endpoints, those PV panels, and actually curtail supply at some times. You're not going to be able to ultimately solve this problem at scale if you can't manage those endpoints. And this becomes a regulatory question, an economic question, and a technical question. But that's sort of the evolution I see of the need to address this. And frankly, from an installer's perspective, if we want to reduce any impediments to deployment of PV, then these are the types of things we're going to have to invest in, because things like interconnection studies are a direct result of the fact that our old design rules were not meant to accommodate, not in all cases, but certainly in increasing penetration scenarios, the PV that's being introduced into the grid.
Yeah, and just sorry to interrupt, but the thing that I think you're just about to get to is storage, obviously, and storage solutions. And we would love to find a storage company that we could partner with if there was only one that existed close at hand. It's on the tip of my tongue. And if we could just partner with this company, it'll come to me. We would be able to work with local utilities, and work with our customers and make it economically viable that they have this storage system, and talk about what you were talking about in your opening, Margarett, about the peak in New York City is a little bit different than where it is in a lot of other places. It's much later, where we can provide value to the local distribution grid and value to our customers and get that storage system deployed. And that's really where we're trying to hit that sweet spot.
So we've pulled in about 12 different things in the last 3 minutes, just to bring it back a little bit. When we look at that scalability, when we're talking about deploying assets like storage, it's a very expensive asset compared to traditional resources. Reconductoring, very expensive to do, especially underground.
Is it more expensive than digging up the street and
that's
wire?
That's I'm not going to get into cost comparisons, but either way, you're talking about major investments, especially storage with a large number of devices. So you get into that scalability question. So right now, if we're looking at where to go with those assets, where would be best placed? I mean, energy was not founded, but by the 30s and 40s, it became a somewhat socially important aspect, or there's a social component to energy distribution as well. How can we target these investments to the best locations without necessarily having? Are there tools available without having tens of thousands of dollars spent on interconnection studies, for instance? Like, where are we right now on pushing these to the right place?
So in New York, I think we've made some pretty good progress working with NYSERDA. And so what the utilities across the state have done with NYSERDA is identify areas that are constrained during the day. And then NYSERDA provides additional incentives in those areas, because NYSERDA is funded through a rate pay, a tax on your bill that funds NYSERDA, so we want that to go back to helping the grid.
Use the T word, Margarett. I don't like the T word.
Fee?
Societal benefit charge.
Charge?
That's
Okay.
what it's called, the
It's a
societal
charge.
benefit charge. System benefit charge.
System benefit, yeah.
It's a charge. And so actually having that go back into the grid and be able to support that grid, I think is really positive. And again, working with installers and with NYSERDA, they've increased that amount enough that I think we're really starting to drive projects in those areas. So I think there are ways to sort of push it. It's a little lumpy, but there are ways to push projects where there are benefits to the utility.
And you've got a really good pilot program that you'll know more about than I do, but where if installers agree to a certain amount of time to provide data, feedback, and openness, the interconnection process is much quicker, smoother, lower fee, all that, so that you can get that data and you can understand how it's interacting with systems better. It's called something.
It's the PV export pilot, is that the one?
So with that, just to get a little bit of an idea, how, when they say a system area where there's congestion, is that purely just on the power side? Is there also any components involving power quality, for instance, voltages, or potential issues with reactive power compensation?
So power quality is really more an issue on the radial systems because the underground networks are so sort of beefy that there's a cushion. And the inverters generally take care of all the power quality issues. The power electronics in the inverter are very powerful and really manage really most of the interconnection issues and are also beginning to be able to manage some of the voltage VAR issues. I think there could start to be VAR concerns when you have a very large installation and then of PV where then the utility is just providing this sort of like ugly, messy power. So I could see that down the road, and I think it's happening in some other places. But
You called that power ugly and messy, not me.
because you're taking all the good stuff. But I think that's really being addressed in other places, and I think again there's technology solutions.
So looking at those technology solutions, Shaun mentioned a little bit earlier the matter of who pays for this.
Right.
Is it the nth consumer that goes solar? Because the first couple on most systems aren't really a problem. Even network systems, as long as there's not backfeed, it's not really too much of an issue. So obviously a lot of engineering that goes into making sure that that is the case. But moving forward, are there changes to the rate structures, to how we deal with interconnection that need to go about? Is it something where we should be putting that on the nth customer, potentially to target solar in certain areas and move developers around to areas that would be best suited? Or is there some other structures out there that you guys have run into that are particularly promising?
You know, to my mind, nationally, I'm not aware of and you might know better than me, Margaret, or anybody else might know better. I don't know of any rate case that has considered this as part of their rate making, platform when they're asking for transmission upgrades, for instance, to say we need transmission upgrades to account for distributed generation. We're talking about PV today, so I'll just say PV. And I don't know of any rate case that has specifically said, we want society to pay for that because it's part of where we're at now.
I mean, there are models that could work. So on the transmission side and actually with gas delivery, if someone, if a large gas main has to be put into the street and there's some headroom left in that, there's some extra there, and somebody else connects down the road, then they would then they would compensate, that customer would then be compensated for creating that headroom. So I think there might be models for it, but there's nothing that I've seen in the PV world.
Okay.
Yeah, at present it seems like, there's always, in every rate case, there's a set of infrastructure allocated for the purposes of maintaining reliability through the distribution system. So I think at this relatively early stage of penetration of PV, naturally, most of the dollars spent to support those activities will come out of those operational budgets. I think there's a bigger issue going forward, though, which is there's the issue relating to net metering, but there's also the issue relating, as I had alluded to earlier, which is as an increasing percentage of customers start to invest in local generation, and as a result, consume fewer kilowatt hours from the grid, but the capital investments required in the grid to maintain reliability are largely the same, or if not increasing, then the burden of the cost in the system actually goes to those that are not adopting. This is a strange form of subsidy. It's subsidy by the non-adopters of the adopters of PV. This also applies to energy efficiency, by the way, too. And so because the costs are socialized in our current rate-based system, that socialization in some ways is going in the wrong direction in this particular case. And it feeds on itself, because as rates increase to those that haven't adopted, then it becomes more financially beneficial for them to adopt, and you get this spiraling effect. Some have called this the utility death spiral. I don't think it's a particularly good characterization of it, but nevertheless, there is this positive feedback in the system. And so the question becomes, how do you ensure that utilities will make the investments necessary to maintain the reliability of the system without asymmetrically burdening those that are using it in the same way they have for the last 100 years? I think that's actually a fundamental problem that those areas that have high PV are already experiencing, whether it's Germany or starting to see that in California or other places for that matter.
So we've gotten.
I feel like, Naimish, you just got a text message from Micah that said this panel's not fiery enough. So I want you to say the exact thing that's going to make Shaun's blood boil. But we can move on.
I just wanted to make sure to get Stacey involved a little bit as well. I didn't
learning
forget
a lot.
about you. Just get
okay.
it. You know, I'm a little bit of a technical, a little bit of a geek at times, so apologize for that. But when it comes down to the investment community involved with this, you know, we start talking about grid upgrades and we start talking about those costs on that next customer, or potentially other. Right now, it's been primarily that nth customer, but potentially going back and saying that the 10 customers that have already installed may have to pay an additional fee, or in Germany, they had to go back and install some intelligence onto inverters, which added an additional cost. How is this affecting the financial community when looking at solar? I mean, it's been viewed largely, I think, as a relatively safe asset, but like, how do those changes around the world, which have been much more dynamic, affect you guys when you're going out raising funds and choosing projects to invest in?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot in your question, so I'll probably end up missing 2/3 of it. I think, just my opinion, when I think about these giant grid questions, from a finance perspective, it's a bit overwhelming because it's not obvious to me to see, you deploy this many, not even hundreds of millions, billions, whatever it may be, what's the return profile. I think that's more economic policy, extremely interesting, extremely important, and ultimately it does bring the investment community in. But what we're doing where I can speak to better, I think, is in terms of in real time, in terms of right now, what is getting investors to part with their money in this space as I've seen it. And it tends to be not so much answering the big questions about what does this mean for this user compared to that user in sort of a policy sense, or what does it mean for upgrading the grid, or what does it mean for this user over that, so much as what I've seen is, because this is early stage investment in the solar space, does this project make sense? Is it a relatively safe investment? Are we going to get our money back? What's going to happen when the government, whoever that is, keeps changing the policies as we see around the world or state by state? And I think the challenge is that the reason I think that one of the reasons PV investment is so difficult is because it is sufficiently safe in theory that it doesn't generate a particularly high return. Just as a blanket level, I might say an equity investor might expect. There's a bit of a range that there's exceptions, but maybe they're expecting 8 to 12%. They're not planning to make multiples of their money the way they might in a high tech boom. And in exchange, they're looking for real safety and security. And where do you find that in a nascent industry? And when you build a solar system properly, as anyone here can tell you, and turn it on, if it generates the electricity that it should, and electricity is worth a lot in that place and time, you can get back your investment. But things start changing when you're dealing with specific state incentives, or you're dealing with the fact that perhaps in that location power prices aren't very high, or perhaps whatever the reason might be. So I think that the investment community, my perspective is kind of waiting to see what happens, as opposed to being the leader in a lot of these interesting kind of macro questions. But on a micro level, there's a great deal of interest in investing. And what I've found it to be, and the reason that we're getting things done for Sunlight General Capital, getting projects built, we've probably deployed maybe some 200 million, in SolarCity much more than that. But the reason it's getting done has been a bit ad hoc, a bit one-off, finding a project that works and then passing up 20 that don't. I don't know that that's a very sophisticated answer, but I think it's a true answer right now. And I think that's how a lot of industries begin. And then you start to synthesize, reduce costs, and so on.
Is the big problem behind that mainly a consistent change? And for instance, like on the federal scale, ITC credits being only a couple of years only having a couple of years in advance notice, or on state levels,
Yes.
sometimes repealing. So it's mainly a policy reason that you're running into that, you feel?
Yes, there's a lot of problems. One is certainly policy in terms of how long can you count on the federal incentive structure. Certainly at the state level, if it's got a floating component, people have been following this, have been watching, New Jersey SRECs or many other things, or feed-in tariffs as they change. That can be a problem. But the third problem, third big one, tends to be that every individual commercial scale property has its own unique credit quality, and there is not a mechanism at this time for dealing with a large quantity of those different kinds of credits. In the housing market, people can look at one's credit score. It's quite difficult to do it in the commercial scale. We have, at Sunlight General Capital, we've primarily done municipal for that reason. We've done some commercial, but we've been able to primarily get there by doing a great deal for schools and libraries and municipal buildings in kind of these public-private partnerships that attempt to bridge not the policy question, which is important, but the credit quality problem.
Okay. Shaun, you seem to be interested.
I agree with
if you
all those
test-
things.
All right. Thank you. So I have a couple questions from the audience. So we've seen a lot of ownership by utilities involving solar. Not a lot of actual development of projects necessarily. Not as much on the development projects, especially on the smaller scale, primarily on the residential scale for that matter. Why have we not seen utilities jump in quite as much, or is there certain types of utilities that are kind of precluded from that?
In terms of ownership?
In terms of actually developing projects or being the throat to choke for a project with a customer?
I mean, the generation assets aren't able to be owned by a lot of utilities in deregulated markets, and that's the primary reason, I think.
Although the subsidiaries of utilities
Sure.
have been...
The subsidiary,
a lot of the
and they're doing a
subsidiaries
tremendous amount. Con Ed Solutions does a ton of work, but Con Ed parent company can't engage in that, so their direct ownership is prohibited. So
Yeah.
but they would love to. I mean, Duke has a proposal right now before their jurisdiction bodies to own residential DG.
Duke does, you said?
Yeah.
And which territories is that?
I'm pretty sure it's North Carolina, but it could be Ohio. I live in Brooklyn. I don't care about the rest of the world.
So yeah, moving off that a little bit onto, looking at stakeholders, for instance.
Yeah.
If you're talking about a lot of money moving from generation of IPPs and utilities that can own generation, for that matter, or wings of the utility that can, towards financed bond-owned assets, essentially. How does that affect actually the stakeholders involved? What happens to a regulated utility looking at potentially losing some revenue if they're vertically integrated? What's the knock-on effects, and what are the winners and losers, essentially, are the people that grow or slow down in that type of environment? And I don't know if anybody wants to take that one. So when it comes down to moving generation from the utilities and IPPs toward financial institutions, toward third-party owners, toward the customer, what happens to the overall utility infrastructure as it's been set up? It's been set up where even utilities that only have distribution oftentimes will have a wing that's deregulated. They'll own generation, but it won't be the same group. What happens to those stakeholders when you have something like reductions in revenues from one wing of an overall holding company?
Yeah. Okay. Great. So now I can get back to this. This is great.
Yeah.
All right. So in the United Kingdom, the way that they take a look at their regulatory utilities. Just kidding. I'm from Brooklyn. I only care about Brooklyn and Europe. So that's, yeah. In the United Kingdom, the way they look at their regulated utilities is it's not volumetric. That is not how they receive their revenue for the investments they make in the grid. It's based on performance metrics and how they're performing to their peers and how they're performing to themselves in past. So that is generally, and I'm speaking very broadly here because I did a graduate school in England, but I didn't pay attention to my electricity bill at all. So I don't know the system that well. But that to me seems like a better model. I mean, if you think about, I'm going to take out my disrupting device right now and read this thing right here that I saved. So we'll take this. This is from a 10K filed in 1993, and I'll let the audience guess on Twitter who wrote this. Wireless portable telephone services allowing customers to make and receive telephone calls, in parentheses mine, read on a stage randomly this text. Make and receive telephone calls from any location, compete with services currently offered by the company, and could result in lost revenues. So go ahead and have at it. Twitter, I won't say who that was. It was a 10K filing in 1993. From a 10K filing in 2012. Distributed generation and storage, a viable, cost-effective alternative to utility bundled electric service through which customers could bypass its distribution and transmission system, may result in loss of customer growth. There's no question that, and that's Pacific Gas and Electric, their 2012 10K filing. There's no question that there's going to be a result in some sort of loss of revenue. Is that a bad thing?
Well, I mean, so not per se, other than the fact that the reliance on the distribution infrastructure is not going to go away, right? I mean, what happens at night when there's no solar? You still need the grid, right? And the investments required to maintain a grid, even if the kilowatt hours flowing through it are reduced, is largely the same.
Well, they're actually just flowing a different direction.
They're flowing a different direction.
So in fact, solar actually needs the grid to be able to make the economics work in many cases.
Right.
That's
so
right.
The beginning of my statement was more about moving from a revenue structure that's based on volumetric
Yes.
and moving to one that's based on performance and getting adequate rate of return to maintain that infrastructure outside of the volumetric. Because I think
Right.
when we get into that volumetric, when we get into it, that's where we're steeply based right now. When it's volumetric, we have no incentive to move to what, frankly, customers just want. I mean, SolarCity is not in the business for SolarCity. I mean, we're in the business because we're following a need that our clients have demanded of us. So customers overwhelmingly want this. So how do we serve that to it? I mean, it would be, and the reason I draw the cell phone comparison, I mean, if we had in 1993 said, boy, I just don't know how this is going to work out, can't allow it to go forward, like this event itself wouldn't be happening. It couldn't happen. So
I agree with you.
Yeah,
so it does
that's my
require a
feeling.
revenue model change, right?
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it, whether it's
Agreed.
performance-based or whether it's capacity-based or whatever it is. But the fundamental constraint here is that the cost in the system of distribution and delivery of electrons to you is not in the electrons. It's in the delivery infrastructure. It's the wires, it's the transformers. Much like in a telecom network, the cost is not in the bits that you consume. The cost is in the routers and the switches and the optical transmission gear and so on and so forth. But in the utility world, we price the end product or service, whatever you want to call it, based on, in effect, the cost of the electrons. But those are not the real costs. And so one model is performance-based, or in UK it's called the RIO model, and it has been successful, actually. Another model is to price the end product based on the capacity that it consumes at peak. So I think there's multiple ways to do it. I think we agree that there needs to be a change.
This brings up a really interesting question, actually. So we're talking about financing and ownership of generation assets. Investors have funded coal plants. They've funded nuke plants, not in a while, but there's one out there now. There's one that's supposed to get built in the next few years. We'll see. But when it comes to that switch, utilities' credit ratings have slowly lowered. The people that are actually building these and the security of even the coal plants as a strong investment over time is lowering. There's concerns around lowering wholesale prices. How does this change for traditional investment and an investment community looking at the security of traditional assets lowering with solar assets coming up? Where do they kind of rank now? And how familiar and comfortable are we seeing our investment in the utility infrastructure as a whole, not necessarily just within Con Ed's stock prices, et cetera?
Well, my own experience there, because before I worked at Sunlight, I was at a bank that did a lot of project finance and invested in all different kinds of power plants. And even though, of course, there's many important differences that play out over the course of just the investment, focusing on the finance side, by and large, they were viewed all in the same model. So if you were looking at a wind farm, a solar farm, a coal-fired plant, whatever it may be, you'd say, well, there's X regulatory hurdles that's going to happen or it isn't, and the power that's going to be generated is going to be this, and this is what it's going to cost to generate that each year or insure it or the feedstock, and then here's the kind of contracts I can get with utilities and what are they rated. So every project, I think, from the investment community, when we're thinking of these large projects in particular, go through the same grid, and I don't think that's bad. I'm not sure that's good. I don't think that matters per se. I think the investment community knows what it wants, but I think it can be rational, and if one thing isn't going to be delivered any longer, there's another way to get there. I don't think people want to invest in coal per se, but as investors, they're looking at a particular risk-return profile, and I think that risk-return profile can be generated in this new economy or not new economy, but in some of these newer technologies. But it's a question of getting investors to the point where they understand how their dollars will be repaid, regardless of what the technology is in the underlying asset.
So my question is, with the actual the profile of what's expected from volumetric sales, for instance, or what's expected from feed-in tariffs, et cetera, over time. Are utilities facing a period in which there's going to be an expectation of increasing cost of capital related to all of these assets? Or is there kind of a balancing act where, is there any increasing costs to capital for fossil fuels versus potentially lower cost of capital for solar?
I could hear what the others have to say. I've not really seen that, but knowing how hard it is, just for example, in isolation, to do a coal-fired plant, I think everyone would expect that would be a very expensive, lengthy, uncertain, and therefore perhaps difficult to finance process. I think that what the challenge that when someone's looking at a power generation plant of any kind, you're not competing just with other types of power. You're competing with every other investment that's out there. So it's quite helpful right now for many of us in the investment space that rates are effectively at zero, because a lot of these returns look quite good. But that's something the utilities have to deal with, is what's just the competing environment for investment of all kinds. So it gets quite complicated.
Yeah.
And there's not really a market on the distribution side right now. So the energy markets are all at the transmission level, and we're talking about generation that's connecting at the distribution level. So I think there may be room for a market at the distribution level, and then how do you value it? There's discussion about, what does grid parity mean? Does it mean the cost of energy at the wholesale level? What's the value of solar? Is it the same as what you might get on the wholesale level, or is there some other additional benefits, additional costs? So I think those are things that'll be figured out, but we're just asking the questions now.
So that actually brings up another very good question. When you're talking about the actual benefits of solar on a particular line, if you're talking about integrating smart inverters, for instance, there's services attached to that would be provided by the smart inverter. And we actually have, right now in Arizona, there was an EEI filing around potential services from smart inverters, potential services from solar to the grid that are not just active power creation. But basically, the comment was that because there's not an understanding of how much that is worth, we should not incentivize it. Right. We should not have a back and forth.
Yeah, EEI's filing was pretty much like, because we don't know how much it's worth, solar should pay for us. Like, solar should pay us.
Yeah. Well, we should keep it at zero, essentially. We should not provide any benefit for reactive power compensation, for instance, from an inverter. That type of understanding in mind, are we going to have a more interactive grid? Is there an actual place, are there places that they're incentivizing those types of services with any type of compensation for the customer? If they have an inverter that's going to last...
PJM presently has
Ancillary
like
services.
ancillary services. Like I said, I'm in Brooklyn. I don't care what happens over there. But
services markets.
right, yeah. So I mean, this is solar grid storage's like primary business model, and they pay for that. It's got to be somewhere around 20 cents a kilowatt hour. I could be wrong.
I've seen some of the numbers. It varies pretty widely. On the fast response stuff, it can get up into the, I just know the fast response is about 3 times the pay of a slower response peaker plant type ancillary service. But within that, is that actually applying to inverters as well, or just to PV plants as well, or is that just for storage assets?
Well, I think it's any dispatchable power that's renewable. And I don't even know if its renewableness is important.
It's the ability to respond within a certain period of time.
Right. If you're just able to dispatch it at a certain period of time, which is totally interesting because PJM was probably the service territory that was hit the hardest by this cold winter snap. I mean, they were just hit remarkably hard by the lack of natural gas and overwhelming their system by it just being the lines being frozen.
And then on the storage side, it's the holy grail. Everybody talks about storage. Everybody wants storage. But where are we actually at with storage and solar? From my understanding, there's some timeline issues with the cost of storage for longer periods of time. But kind of what's the current situation? How realistic is that be in the next couple of years, something that can really help benefit and help mitigate any of the problems related to solar?
You want to go first?
No, you
have a view? Well, so, I mean, the challenge with any storage technology, much like really any grid-oriented technology, is that, unfortunately, it doesn't benefit from a Moore's law. So, most technologies we've become used to in the networking arena and the consumer microelectronics arena, they all benefit from a Moore's law, which gives rise to cost reduction on a periodic basis. But storage and most storage technologies really benefit ultimately from volume. That's how most of their cost comes down. There are some fundamental material science and chemistry things you can do to reduce the cost and increase the reliability. But in effect, there's a bootstrap problem here, which is if you want to get to the low cost, you need to drive volumes. And there's ways that those can be jump-started through subsidies and things like that, much like subsidies were used to jump-start the solar learning curve. But at least our assessment, Gridco's assessment, that is that it still will be some time until the economics of energy storage will enable it to be deeply deployed within the grid. What I'm excluding here is peaker plant replacement. Deep into the grid, but at the high levels, you actually are close to being able to make a business case for it. But into the leaves of the grid, into the distribution of the grid, it'll still take some time. I'm hoping that the company whose name you can't remember will actually will be able to drive that learning curve faster.
Oh, wow. Was that a pun? We're working on accelerating that process.
All right.
Tough audience, eh? I was going to say the exact same thing you said. Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, like right now, when you're looking at the business case around storage, what are you guys actually pushing at? If we're not to that point where it's deep in the
What
grid
is the thing you
necessarily.
can get from SolarCity right now?
Well, like what are you seeing in the market as a whole, not necessarily a full-out plug?
Okay. Well, I don't know. How
What are you
specific
seeing
the question
from commercial energy storage in the distribution grid? Why is this something we're even talking about if it's not yet ready?
I mean, friends in the fuel cell community have something of a solution. It's not exactly storage, but it's baseload power that can be, constant serving load. So, and with the price of natural gas, it has been low. It's recently been high. That's been just a roadblock. I mean, I'm not putting a plug. I'm just saying that what we're trying to do is we're working on some commercial deployment in areas with high demand charges. That's the area of first concern. Obviously, that's.
We know which one that is.
Yeah. All right. That's fair.
But there's
Yeah.
so many industries working on battery technologies that, something's bound to give. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
And so with that, I think we have some questions from Twitter.
Yeah, we do. And actually, we have, first of all, I think we have our very first person watching the live stream from Kansas City. So that's really exciting. So there are people outside of Brooklyn who are watching this event, which is great.
Was it only to say?
Yeah.
Just only to yell at me.
And also, you were like, I don't mean to disrupt by looking at my phone. We actually encourage our panelists to be tweeting while they're talking. So if you guys can do that at the same time.
I was making a disruptive technology joke.
Yeah, that was good. I liked it. And then we actually have somebody from the audience who put in their for the person who had the quote that you mentioned, AT&T.
No.
Okay. Do you want to tell us?
Bell Atlantic.
Bell Atlantic. Okay.
Because they don't exist anymore.
All right, and we've had just amazing questions, amazing comments. I won't be able to get through all of them. There were a bunch of questions about economic implications, so I think you covered them, but if you guys want to talk more about that, feel free. We actually had a question, can you talk about the opportunities for entrepreneurs in the solar space as we are entering the expansion of disrupted PV? A very cool question from, at GProUrban. As the ratio of clean energy to fossil energy rises, what's the inflection point where policies change and what are the changes? So I don't know if you want to take a tack at that question. And then a final one, going back to when Shaun was doing his disruptive technology moment, at NW Green, shift from wired to wireless phone came with a shift in service. What is different in the service in the electricity business model with PV? So lots of great questions and comments, and hopefully that'll spark the last 5 minutes of the discussion.
So I think the last one, actually, when we're talking about service in the electric industry, I shouldn't say everybody, but much of the discussion in the last few years has been utilities can enter the services sphere, the energy services are going to blow up, microgrids would be one of those, potentially energy management would be another one. First off, I'm just curious for Twitter, because I want to check back on this later, what do you actually want out of your electric grid? And if people will tweet that, it'd be awesome. As well as what are we actually providing and what's, for you guys, what's the actual service underlying everything? Is there an expansion services that are suddenly available through things like PV?
Do you want each of us to answer?
I think let's start with Naimish and we'll move down.
Okay. Well, I think I perhaps have a little bit more traditional view on this topic than others, but there's often analogies made between service differentiation, in particular that we saw in the telecom arena and what's given rise to all of our fun devices now, and service differentiation and power. And I submit actually that it's much harder to differentiate power than it is bits. And I think the fundamental differentiators are reliability, is it there when you need it? It's cost, can you afford it? It's convenience. And then I would say there's an additional set of potential differentiators around those that care where their power comes from, green or not, for example, and those that want some additional IT-enabled insight into their power consumption. But beyond those, it's actually quite difficult. I'd actually submit to you to come up with different ways of differentiating power to end customers. I think it's quite difficult, actually. And so I do see an opportunity to, within those class of differentiators that I just mentioned, actually address a broader market. Because even in things like resiliency, there is a certain demographic that would be very willing to pay more on a monthly basis if under an outage, they could be guaranteed with some probability that their power is recovered. That demographic certainly exists. The current regulatory structure doesn't allow us to address that demographic in an easy way, an economically viable way. So I think there's ways to differentiate service in those modes, albeit with certain changes to the regulatory structure and financial recovery structures for utilities. But I submit that it's beyond the things I mentioned, perhaps with a couple of others. It's actually difficult. And I think the analogies with other industries, particularly telecom, fall short there, frankly.
Well, considering the length of that answer, I think maybe like your top 2 or 3 for the rest of the panelists.
I agree with that completely. I have a hard time thinking what differentiation would look like. I do know that as having been out selling the bringing of solar PV to schools and institutions and hospitals and businesses, they care about reliability, they care about cost, and they're concerned that in the event of a blackout, the first thing they ask is, will my solar work? And the first thing I say is no. And it is what it is, but those are the variables people care about the most. And I'm not going to elaborate and take too much more time, but I agree.
Well, I agree, and we're addressing those 3 things. One is reliability. Those are the first places that we've, in the event of a blackout, we know that market exists because those are the first places we deployed residential battery. So that market exists, and that's been deployed. The other is and I'll just anecdotally say this, and I'm nameless, but I had a friend who had their electricity bill, and the meter just didn't get read for a while. And then, like a bunch of months later, that particular utility was like, "Hey, we need $400 from you because we didn't read the meter, and you consume more, and we didn't know." And the friend was like, "What?" I mean, if you walked into a coffee shop and it was $2 for, they charged you $2, and then like a couple months later, they're like, it was actually $3. Could you pay us the money that we didn't charge you? You'd be like, go screw yourself. So one of the things that we obviously have is monitoring all the time, and solar systems are monitored 24/7, even in the night. And when there's a problem, we know it before the customer knows it, and we're out there to fix it. And I think with yes, the electrons are on, all that people care is working, but at the end of the month when you're truing up your bills and saying, how much did I pay, the knowing that it cost what you said it was going to cost is sort of important.
So I think until recently, you generally didn't even want to know about your utility unless it wasn't there, and then you really wanted to know about it. And I think that's starting to change. I agree with you, Naimish, that those are what you mentioned are the things that we can imagine people want from the grid, but I think maybe, we're so sort of stuck in how we think about it that maybe there are things we haven't figured out yet. So I'd like to think that the people here can help figure out what you want from your grid and what you're willing to pay for what kind of services. But I think we're all a little stuck in how we've been thinking about it and could use some prodding to think outside how we've been thinking.
Yeah, it definitely introduces a lot of questions around if you have pay for reliability, for instance, how does that end up working? Do you have a similar problem with, is it that one customer that has to pay? How does that end up being socialized across everybody who's actually desiring that? And scalable infrastructure is not something that's, depending on the clusters of what customers are looking for certain types of services, scalable infrastructure is very difficult to put in place. So with that, I think we're pretty much concluding. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. Do a nice little round of applause. Thank everyone in the audience, as well as those that are watching via the live stream, as well as New York, NYC Acre, and Solar One for putting on the event.
And thank you to Ben for moderating. Yay. So this concludes our event. The panelists will be here to ask or to answer any of the questions that didn't get asked during the live stream. There were amazing questions, Twitterverse. Thank you so much. This was like an awesome social time. And now it's time for beer and networking. So thank you everybody for coming. This is a great last event. Yay.